Hello everyone, welcome to our third webinar. This is a series of webinars that are conducted by our working group called Postcolonial Perspectives on and within Development Studies, based at EADI, European Association for Development Research and Training Institute. Before we invite our speaker for today, there are a few technical details that I would like to talk about. After the talk, we will have a question and answer session for which you can either unmute yourself to ask a question or you can type your comments in the chat box. For reasons of smooth flow of the internet, we would ask you to keep your videos switched off and your mics muted so that we could hear the sound more clearly. And just for your information, we would be recording the talk for later use as a link. As for the speaker today, I have known Dr. Aram Ziai since 2012. He has been a great friend, an inspiration, an esteemed scholar working on post-development and post-colonial studies. I would say this working group itself has come out of many formal and informal discussions we had with Dr. Ziai. Now I would like to invite my co-convener, Dr. Yulia, to introduce formally our speaker. Yulia, the floor is yours.
Thank you, Aftab. So yeah, maybe just to clarify, of course you're welcome to switch on your camera, but yeah, please only do so when you are speaking. So because there might be too much strain on the internet connection if we have everyone on at the same time. Yes, we're very, very glad and honored that Aram Ziai is joining us today. He's currently Heisenberg-Professor of the German Research Foundation, the DFG, for Development Policy and Postcolonial Studies at the University of Kassel in Germany. And previously, he has been teaching and researching at the universities of Aachen, of Magdeburg, Amsterdam, Vienna, Bonn, and Accra. His focus lies in the fields of development theory and policy, of post-colonial and post-development approaches, and of global economic governance. Very recently, he has edited a special issue of the Third World Quarterly Journal, which was on post-development 25 years after the Development Dictionary. And it's well worth taking a look into. Today he will talk to us about decolonizing development policy and most intriguingly speak about Ethiopians in Zhengistan. So yeah, thanks Aram for joining us today, and the floor is yours.
Hey, thanks a lot, Julia. Thanks a lot, Aftab, for the very, very kind introduction and for the invitation and the ability to, the opportunity to give a lecture here in this webinar. I would like to show some slides, so I will be trying to share them. Okay, so let me know if it works. So can you see the slides?
Yes, I can.
Okay, wonderful. All right, my talk's entitled Ethiopians in Zhengistan, Decolonising Development Policy, and basically consists of these two parts. In the first part, I would like to invite you on a journey. Let us go back a few centuries into the age where continents were discovered, to the 15th century, to be precise. And history tells us about the words of the great mariner reporting on his journeys. He said, "We have traversed more than 100,000 li of immense water spaces and have beheld in the ocean huge waves like mountains rising sky high. We have set eyes on barbarian regions far away." So these words have been spoken by the leading explorer and captain of the largest and technically most advanced fleet of the time. His name is Zheng He. Although he is largely unknown in Europe, his journeys are comparable to those of Vasco da Gama or Christopher Columbus. So, in fact, he was Chinese, and he undertook 7 multi-year voyages, which are depicted here. So his voyages took him from Nanjing down to South Asia, down to India, and then further west into the Persian Gulf, and to Mecca, and to East Africa even. So one of these barbarian regions he mentioned was actually the region where my father was born, what today is Iran. Looking at the map depicting his journeys, I began to wonder what would have happened if he had sailed round the Asian continent in the opposite direction. So, in the opposite direction, basically then surrounding the continent and arriving then at the northwestern part. And what if one of these barbarian regions had been instead the one in which my mother has been born, what today is called Germany? And what, to pursue this historical fiction a bit further, what if for some strange reason he had gotten the idea that this western part of Asia was in fact a continent on its own? And further, what if this continent had been named after the mariner who had supposedly discovered it? And let us further assume that Zheng He had mistakenly assumed this region where he had arrived to be a part of Ethiopia, and that the population living there had been correspondingly designated. We would today be living as Ethiopians in Zhengistan. Now, admittedly, this story seems rather far-fetched, but of course it is not. It is not regarding America, Amerigo Vespucci, Christopher Columbus, and the people designated as Indians or American Indians. So this story highlights that 500 years of colonialism have left traces of an era in which 85% of the surface of the earth had been discovered and subdued by Europeans believing themselves to be chosen by God or by virtue of their belonging to the white race to rule over other peoples. So the designation of the American continent and its indigenous population is a constant reminder. Our view of the world is not free from these traces of colonialism. Traces that the postcolonial and decolonial studies aim to reveal. And these traces are already manifest in the map that we see in front of us. This is the Mercator projection of 1568, still frequently in use today. And in this map, Europe is represented actually to be far larger than it actually is. It seems to be roughly the size of Latin America or South America. Now, while in fact, Europe is little more than half the size of South America, 9.7 million square kilometers in comparison to 17.8. So that these maps depict Europe as being on the top and in the middle is quite fitting in this context. Other kinds of maps provoke raised eyebrows and confusions, just as we see in the TV series West Wing, of which I'm going to show you a short clip. I hope you can hear it.
When third world countries are misrepresented, they're likely to be valued less. When Mercator maps exaggerate the importance of Western civilization, when the top of the map is given to the Northern Hemisphere, the bottom is given to the Southern, then people will tend to adopt top and bottom attitudes.
But wait, where else could you put the Northern Hemisphere but on the top? On the bottom. How?
Like this.
Yeah, but you can't do that.
Why not?
Because it's freaking me out.
Because it's freaking me out. As I said, raised eyebrows and confusion are the most regular results when people are confronted with a map of the world which looks not like this, but like this. So let us pursue this alienation a bit further, and let us engage with method of historical fiction in order to question what seems self-evident to us and what freaks us out. So let us imagine, how would we live here in Europe as Ethiopians in Zhengistan, having suffered 500 years of colonialism? First of all, maybe the country we live here now would be called the province of Chinese Central Zhengistan. And maybe in this country there would be only few survivors of the tribe of the Hessians after the genocide of 1904, where the military chief of Chinese Central Zhengistan ordered an insurgency against colonial rule to be oppressed with the statement, "The race war can only be ended by the annihilation of one of the parties." Even a century later, the genocide, identified unanimously as such by historians, had not been recognized by the Chinese government. There would be no official apologies, let alone reparations. These would only be paid among Asian nations. Instead, there would be some financial transfers entitled development aid, which were regularly designated as generous, just like in the case of the Herero and Nama in Namibia. And in Asian and even most Zhengistanian school books, the era of colonialism would be portrayed as partly positive, because colonial rule had, after all, provided employment and built motorways. Concerning agriculture, probably our agriculture would be geared to the export of exotic foodstuffs, with huge plantations of asparagus, as we see here, or of apples, instead of prioritizing basic needs of the local population. Maybe 70% of the fertile ground will still be owned by descendants of the Asian colonizers, just like in Namibia today. Our resources would have been systematically exploited, but we had gained nothing from this, apart from gigantic holes in the ground as a remnant of open pit mining and railways leading to the next harbor. Because the processing of resources, the coal, power plants, and the production of value all would be located on the other side of the planet. Probably even decades after formal independence from our colonizers, our state would not really be sovereign. Perhaps our first democratically elected socialist government, led by Willy Brandt, had been put down by a military coup orchestrated by some foreign secret service, just like it happened in Chile in 1973. Perhaps there would have been so many coups here in the area of Zhengistan that someone had actually coined the term asparagus republic to denote such political systems under the colonial influence. Maybe we would have to pay back the debt accumulated by dictatorships established by such military coups, supported by the secret services of other nations, just like in South Africa or the Democratic Republic of Congo. And maybe a political intervention of the IMF in 1998 had prevented that a left-wing politician like Oscar Lafontaine had become our head of state, just like in South Korea at the time. Turning to the field of sports and culture, probably our best football players would be lured into the rich clubs of the major Asian leagues at an early age, where they would play in teams of Shanghai or Guangzhou and be ridiculed as apes because of their facial and body hair. Groß, Götze, and Müller would be greeted by ape sounds when they entered the stadium, and people would throw bananas at them. And many of the women, especially the women in Zhengistan, would probably undergo cosmetic surgery in order not to be called long nose anymore. Probably our traditional cultural practices would be considered backward and ridiculous even, or even barbaric and misogynist, just like just like the practice of dressing up young girls as so-called Tanzmariechen during the carnival season, which has just been last weekend, in costumes which deliberately reveal their underwear. In some areas, these cultural practices were surely banned by law. Also, Christian fundamentalists who try to achieve their religion's supremacy through violent means in Northern Ireland, who commit terrorist acts against abortion clinics and the doctors in Georgia, USA, or who establish a Catholic state in the Vatican, or who defend the Christian Occident by mass murder in Norway, all these would be seen as representative of the Christian faith in general. Christians in Asia would constantly be challenged to renounce Christian terrorism and reject their backward religion. And probably each year, legions of volunteers would come from China to Zhengistan, working in development aid, taking care of white orphans or fighting poverty, often without any qualification apart from their origin in a developed country. Now, post-development, post-colonial and decolonial critiques have convincingly shown that these traces of colonialism are particularly visible nowadays in development policy. There is no need to reiterate the findings of Escobar, Nandi, Apfel-Maglin, Shiva, Kotari, McEwen, Kapoor, Erickson-Bas, and many others. But how can this critique be translated into political demands? There are some suggestions I would like to make. First of all, the inherent Eurocentrism of development policy could be avoided by no longer identifying a good society with the model dominant in Europe and North America, and by taking into account alternatives beyond the Western ways of organizing the economy, politics, and knowledge. To be precise, one should actually not be talking about the Western model, but about the hegemonic model, which came to be dominant in the West, because also within the West, there have been alternatives and counter-hegemonic trends and currents. So examples would be practices of collective ownership or grassroots democracy in the Zapatista communities in Chiapas, Mexico. So here we see the sign, you're entering Zapatista territory. Here the people, oh God, now I'm lacking the word, aquí manda. Here the people give orders and the government obeys. Junta de Buen Gobierno, so Council of Good Government of the Zapatistas. So here we have the imperative mandate, so that representatives are not free to do what they want and to follow their conscience, but are supposed to do what the people ask them to. In the field of development policy, if we actually want to retain the idea of universal indicators of a good society, we could actually also include racism, domestic violence, rates of crime, of suicide, or of mental illness. We could also use indicators like these, just like the subjective well-being of people or their relationship to nature. Actually, the Happy Planet Index or the Gross National Happiness Index are first attempts in this regard. The Happy Planet Index, which is depicted here in the picture, actually measures well-being, life expectancy, inequality, and the ecological footprint, and comes to a slightly different conclusion about which models of society seem to be more advanced than others. Also, the colonial assumption at the basis of development cooperation about the geographical distribution of problem-solving knowledge, well, on the one hand, we have problems in the south and we have knowledge to solve these problems in the north, can be avoided in two ways. First of all, through simply the abolishment of technical cooperation, or at least through no longer sending white development experts to the south. Or through introducing experts from the south, which can spread their knowledge on Ubuntu, on gachacha chords, or on acupuncture, on Buddhism, on Pachamama, in order to contribute to solving social problems in the North. A minimal step in this direction of intercultural exchange, instead of one-way teaching, could be seen in the introduction of a reverse component in the German volunteer service, Weltwärts, which came about as a reaction to repeated post-colonial critique. However, we need to take the critique a bit further. As the national elites have taken over the principle of trusteeships from the colonizers after independence, which is visible in the construction of indigenous and rural groups as backward and less developed, this cannot suffice. We need to tackle the hierarchies between development experts and affected persons. Development cooperation actually has moved in this direction, at least since the 1980s, through the principle of participation. However, as long as participation is confined to implementation and does not start with defining the problem already, and as long as financial transfers are structured by the division between recipients and donors, concepts like participation, ownership, and empowerment will be unable to change the existing relations of power. Possible reforms include Easterly's idea, William Easterly, his idea of vouchers for projects to be redeemed with a chosen development organization, leading to more self-determination for the supposed beneficiaries, or it could also include the introduction of accountability mechanisms like the World Bank Inspection Panel, allowing affected persons a certain degree of control, or at least the ability to complain about the developers and about standards in social and environmental areas which are not being abided. So if development policy, and this is the next point, is intended to improve the material standards of living of the less privileged part of humanity, then of course it has to confront primarily existing neo-colonial economic structures and the financial transfers from the south to the north, dwarfing the official development assistance. The debt service, the repatriation of profits by transnational corporations, tax evasion, and illicit financial flows used by elites to channel money to Swiss bank accounts. So the graph here, taken from therules.org, is actually telling us already about $2 trillion going each year from the south to the north. In fact, the flows from the north to the south are not as tiny as depicted here if we include remittances and foreign direct investment, but still considerably lower, probably around 1/3 of the 2 trillion which travel in the opposite direction. So it's a development policy which is indeed concerned with improving the material standards of living has also to take note of these remittances by migrants and see labor migration as an effective way of struggling against poverty. Nowadays, these remittances amount to 3 times the official development assistance. It has also to take note of the aggressive economic policies of the EU, the US, and other rich countries supported by IMF, World Bank, and WTO, which pry open other markets while protecting their own markets, especially in the field of agriculture, covered by exception to the WTO rules. Finally, development policy, which is really concerned with these standards of living, has to put on the agenda also the issue of reparations for colonial exploitation, wars, and genocides, and the issue of abandoning the imperial mode of production and living, which is based on importing cheap resources and cheap labor, and whose consequences are borne mostly by those marginalized in the current world order anyway. Consequences like droughts, hurricanes through climate change, or even less natural disasters like the Rana Plaza collapse a few years ago. So, in my view, the problem in today's world is not only vast global inequality, but also the way in which the struggle against global inequality is framed primarily as one for development and increased development aid, which is still fraught with colonial patterns such as teaching those less developed than ourselves. It is framed not, and it could be, as a struggle for self-determination and against exploitation and oppression. To conclude, already half a century ago, Frantz Fanon told us that humanity expects more from us, or especially from the third world, than an imitation of Europe, and that we need to develop new concepts. So from the perspective of those interested in decolonizing development policy, I would like to tell him we're working on it. So thanks for the attention.
Thank you very much, Aram, for this inspiring talk. And I think there will be a lot of comments and questions to this. So I would like to invite everyone, to comment, to ask questions. Please feel free either to put your questions in the chat box or just unmute yourself and talk.
Hi, sorry, should do this. Thank you very much for talking. I just wonder, because I'm working in a smaller development NGO who's working on war and education, and I really liked your inputs, and I would like to know more about the framing development thing, because you mentioned education, and we are trying our best to not impose ideas of how to educate, and we're not the people educating, we're financing NGO. So what we do is that we contribute payment, that's how we strengthen the water infrastructure. And regarding the school, we pay partly the programs for water-related jobs, professions. And we don't teach or tell them how to teach, but what we did was to suggest that there are workshops to, practice the practical aspect of what they learn in theory. And if you can give a bit more input about the educational part or the framing and where you see that there can be challenges and issues, because I think that would be very helpful for us. Thank you very much.
Okay, this is actually a difficult question for me to respond. Can you hear me?
Yeah, I can.
Okay. Well, because on the one hand, I see, of course, that within the vast field of development policy, there are many useful and meaningful things being done with the official development assistance, and I'm a bit shy in criticizing all this.
Don't be shy. I criticize us a lot myself, so go ahead.
Yeah. So I mean, the question would be what. I think the decisive point is, first of all, besides the structure that children are actually being sent to schools where they are being taught by teachers, they're actually being removed from the families and their parents and their occupation and their knowledge. So, which is a critique which has been voiced by Ivan Illich already decades ago. So apart from this structure, I think the decisive point would then be, of course, okay, what are children being taught, and does it have a relation to their life, to their society? Is it taking place in a language that they speak? So these would be pressing issues as well. And I think I mentioned the Zapatistas, and they are actually trying to establish to keep the structure of the school, but to fill it with new content. So first of all, to teach the children in indigenous languages, and then also to teach contents which do not prepare them merely for a career in Mexico City, but which would actually also help them to cope with life in rural Chiapas. So so this is probably not very satisfying for you, but this would be the lines of an answer that come to my mind.
All right, thank you.
Okay, any more questions, comments, thoughts?
If I may, if there's nobody else talking right now, can I take the floor?
Sure, Arthur, go ahead.
Okay, thank you. Once again, Aram, many thanks for such a wonderful talk. I have rather difficulty in pointing another dimension of the equation. So you talked about how the experts from the north to the south is a problem, but the way I see it is how the south or a colonial subject is being portrayed in the north. So there's an influx of a lot more refugees now in Germany, in many other parts of the Europe as well. So my point would be, if we consider it's a two-way project, that colonial self or a non-European self is portrayed in a certain way in the colonial in the powerful countries. Do you see there is anything happening at that level of perception formation within Germany or within Europe to change those images, to change those perceptions? Or do you think that the ideas in the north are still the same?
I think there are very, very interesting processes going on in the long term concerning precisely this image, this self-perception of Germany. And this is, this is where basically in the media and also in ads, in advertisements, I think there is an increasing trend that German people are sometimes today also depicted as non-white, and this is a very new thing. This is something which did not exist like 15 years ago, I'd say. And I think this is a consequence of the increasing recognition. Okay, we live actually in an immigration society, and we have a huge percentage of people who have been migrating themselves, who have come here as refugees in the past 2 years, or whose parents at least have been migrating some time ago. And I think these are precisely the battles and struggles which lead some people which lead the 13% to vote for the AfD, because
exactly.
These are the fears of, our German identity is endangered because of this influx of migrants. And I think in this respect, I think there are progressive changes going on. I still recall President Wolf stating, yes, of course, the Islam belongs to Germany, which led to an outcry on the right wing of the political spectrum. And I think these processes are going on, and they're going into a good direction, but they are leading to severe aggressions and violence in a relatively small part of the population. But but I'm optimistic that this change of German self-perception will basically take us to a point where in maybe 10, 20 years, it will be perfectly normal, and probably maybe then the AfD will still exist, but we'll have we'll maybe have even a non-white president.
Okay, thank you.
I have a question here of Henriette. She's asking, you say one should get rid of the concept of development, but isn't this a selfish argument to tell others that they don't have the rights to develop if we see development in dimensions of basic needs? How to solve the dilemma of development aid, which is, how you explain, to be seen critical and Eurocentric and the colonial here, but on the other side, we as white Germans have a historic duty, or even that, because we did so much harm to other people, for example, in Africa. So isn't this unfair to let them down, let them alone? And how could a really equal partnership between Europe and Africa be established?
Okay. Well, from a certain point of view, it would be unfair, but therefore my political demands here in this lecture have actually not been leave them alone, but included, for example, also the issue of colonial reparations. So, in fact, there is it's a difficult thing. So, basically, I would say the question of global inequality is nowadays framed in terms of development. So if I plead for a abandonment of this concept of development, this does not mean an abandonment of doing something about global inequality, but doing it differently. Doing it maybe based on concepts of exploitation, of oppression, of colonialism, and not based on this concept of development, which still somehow implies the idea, well, there are the developed countries in Western Europe and North America and the non-developed countries. So, and now you might say, well, okay, but still there is this huge difference in life expectancy, etc., etc. And I perfectly agree that that this is a problem and that this is a dilemma. And so my suggestion would be twofold, basically. So on the one hand, I would in fact plead for decoupling the idea of a good society from the rich industrial capitalist society that we have here in Western Europe and North America, and which is basically based on this imperial mode of living and based on large inequalities. But secondly, I would still argue, okay, but for many people on this earth, global inequality is a pressing issue and is a matter of life and death. And therefore, we should be doing something about global inequality, but maybe not in terms of sending development experts in the South who then do poverty reduction projects, but then tackling the real issues: world trade, debt, imperial mode of living, reparations, migration. And these are things, I think, which would be far more effective in terms of this issue of global inequality or poverty reduction, but are usually not being talked about very much within development cooperation. This would be my answer. So how can a really equal partnership between Europe and Africa be established? Well, this is difficult given given this history of inequality and colonialism. And I think these steps of decolonizing development policy would point into this direction so that a partnership could be enabled in the future.
Hi.
Hello?
Yes, I would like to...
sorry, Andrew, to interrupt. We have Sonia first.
Okay.
And then we have a question by AB and Simona, and then I will take you on the list so we don't have the confusion, okay?
Okay.
Sonia, and just another comment from Henriette. She says, I totally agree. Thank you for clarifying. So, Sonia, yeah, maybe you.
Yeah, hello, my name is Sonia. I'm Sonja Gündüz. I'm from the DGB Bildungswerk, so the educational arm of the German Trade Union Federation. And I would like to say I really liked your presentation, and I also really like the story you start with. So, a really funny manner when you start to imagine things differently. And I would like to ask, did you also have some research or some investigation about the topic of construction of knowledge in a different way? Because like the way we see the world, the way we construct our knowledge, what apparently is common knowledge for all, is a really important point of how we see the world and how we do development or not doing it or whatever. So this I would like to know, and how you connect this with democratization. Yeah, you understand my question?
Yeah. Yes. Okay. So actually, there is quite a bit of literature on that, on different knowledge systems and how within colonialism, basically the European knowledge system based on a certain idea of what counts as knowledge, as modern science, was then implemented all over the world, leading basically to the repression, to the oppression and to the abandonment of other knowledges which were maybe also very valuable. So this is something that Frédéric Apfel-Maglin or also Ashish Nandy have written very interesting books about. And recently this thread has been taken up by Boaventura de Sousa Santos, who wrote about epistemologies of the South, and who also highlighted this aspect that basically for a just world, we also need to have epistemological justice, how he calls it. So that we need to get away from what he calls the monoculture of knowledge, that there is just one knowledge system and this is the one originating in the West, modern sciences, etc. But that we need to accept different kinds of knowledge, which often also include a spiritual dimension. So if we think about indigenous healers in Latin America or Africa. So
Barbarian knowledge, for example.
Yes, there's all kinds of knowledge, and this is where Sousa Santos also links this idea of knowledge also to the idea of democratization. So basically, that people have also a right to have their own knowledge system, and that this is also a kind of democratic right which has been neglected so far, also in development policy.
Mm-hmm.
So I don't know if this answer was.
I mean, we probably would need another hour to get a bit more deeply, but yeah, thanks.
Thanks.
Okay, so the next question would be, what's your opinion about the recent Oxfam scandal? Do you think the incidents in Haiti and Chad, as well as the deafening silence afterwards, can be located in post-colonial development debate in general?
Okay, I have actually given an interview yesterday about this Oxfam scandal because suddenly people start asking questions about development policy. I actually don't think, okay, this is just my opinion, but I think it is not a good way to see what happened there, and to see these people, basically exhibiting criminal behavior and engaging in sexual crimes, maybe even, as linked to this, as representative of development policy or of development organizations, or and inherently linked to the structure of development cooperation. I think this would do injustice to the many morally, the many ethical and motivated and passionate people I know working in development cooperation. I think, of course, we have, and this is my basic motivation to do all this. We have pressing issues of relations of power in development cooperation. We have hierarchies, we have authoritarian elements, depoliticizing elements, and colonial patterns. But I'm not sure if it is a good idea to basically link these crimes of individuals to the basic structure, because then, I think within corporations or within state organizations having nothing to do with it, with development policy, things like that happen as well, and maybe even more often. and now the public attention is now so great because, well, because of this image, okay, that development organizations, especially development NGOs, they're sort of these do-gooders, and now we see even the do-gooders are in fact nasty, not so nice people. So this would be my answer.
Maybe I can slightly dare to disagree on that, because well, I'm not. I mean, you rightly say it's not, you cannot put everything in one pot, or everyone who's really intent on doing good work, and I guess the majority of people is. But I think the system really allows it, and I think what's going on at the moment is like an Oxfam bashing. It's like, oh my God, Oxfam is so bad. Oxfam is so bad. It's not Oxfam. It happens everywhere in every organization, and I can talk for Haiti, and I mean there's in Port-au-Prince there are certain clubs and bars, and everyone knows that's the proper place to pick up Haitian girlfriends, and all the expats go and they do, and I mean this is not even talking of like formal prostitution. This is girlfriend, and it's exactly these relationships of power and exploitation and these relations of power, of hierarchy, and I think it's part of the thing that, well, at least I interpreted it like this. There were a lot of people after the Haitian earthquake being flown in, just basically straight from university. They didn't have a clue of anything that was going on. It was just pure devastation after the earthquake. They were getting paid a huge amount of money. They were completely, didn't know how to handle the thing, the whole situation. And just as quickly, people get flown out again. So it's just this really, you come and you're being told you're the white savior. You get a lot of money, and it really, I think it really helps to build this system of power hierarchy. And especially when you on the other hand you have people who are desperate, who are just desperate. So but yes, of course, I mean it's too easy to say to put everything in one, in one pot. It's never black and white. But I think how these humanitarian interventions work, and you already mentioned experts. These people are told they are experts. Like, as I said, they're being flown in, but they're not experts of that particular country or that particular context. So I think it's this whole. But before I talk too much, we had the next question of Simone, who cannot talk because her mic is not working. But she first of all says thank you for the great talk. I think you make clear and fair points. However, many of these structures are dependent on economic and political gains by Western countries, and I'm quite doubtful that this may change anytime soon. Who and where do you think change will come from if solutions for an equal partnership were readily available?
So I think this is then referring to the latter part of these, how to decolonize development policy structures. Many of these structures are dependent on, I think so. Where change may come from. I think, well, my impression is that within development cooperation, many young people are now quite aware of the criticism, of the post-colonial criticism of development cooperation. And I think if now some of them are still entering the institution and entering the institutions and working in development cooperation, I think it still does make a difference. So I think that some part of change will be coming from within. Some part of the change will be coming from outside, outside the development organizations, from protest movements. So a significant part of my work in the past years has been referring to these accountability mechanisms and to the inspection panel of the World Bank, which came about as a consequence of protest movements against the Narmada Valley Development Project in India. And I think if people take to the streets, if people do not abide by the rules, engage in civil disobedience, or even in violent protests, this has political consequences. And yeah, so I think that this combination of protest movements and internal critics is able to do something, to change something. I mean, some of the issues mentioned in the last part are, of course, yeah, not easy to tackle. I perfectly agree. But I think these are the things we need to talk about in the next years and decades. And so we better start changing the agenda. So.
Thank you, Aram. So I guess if I'm not wrong, Julia, we have now Andrew. Andrew, would you like to pose your question?
Oh, you have to unmute your microphone.
See how I can do that.
Okay. Yes, now we hear you.
Okay, so my name is Andrew, and I am from Uganda, but I am a student at Lund University in Sweden. And this comes at a very interesting time because the last book I read was The Making and Unmaking of the Third World by Escobar, and we are still, grappling around with the book and trying to understand it. So I need to highlight a few things so that you can give me some input about them. Should we be talking about alternatives to development or development alternatives? I know the two concepts are different, and I'm sure you can find a way of dealing with it other than scrapping off development completely, because it looks like we either need both or we maybe need one of them. And then I would like to find out from you, how do we deal with the governance issue in third world countries? Because third world countries are most affected. Most third world countries have resources that can actually cause the desired development. But what is the problem? How do we deal with this to make sure that we get a good bargain for what we have to offer to the world? And then I also wanted to emphasize that it's possible inequalities are everywhere in the world and not necessarily in third world countries, because my short time in Sweden has shown me one or two things that the inequalities are no longer global south, but more or less horizontal, and every country has its own challenges with inequalities, but I think they are more pronounced in the third world. So how do we deal with the ones in the third world? And finally, local or grassroots-led development that Escobar is sort of emphasizing. How do we get the local on the global agenda from your expertise, from your experience? And especially at a point where Escobar seems to be taking a different twist in his latest preface. Thank you so much.
Okay. So I'll try to respond to your points. Okay. First of all, I think well, my position would be to look for the alternatives to development. But then, of course, it's a question of, okay, how exactly do you define this? Now, I would be for alternatives to development if development entails becoming like the developed countries. So having, in political terms, a liberal, representative, parliamentary party democracy as the standard model of politics. So in economic terms, having a capitalist model based on the idea of individual ownership and the concept of the homo economicus in terms of knowledge, accepting only what counts as modern science and compatible as based actually on Cartesian rationality and on a relation to nature, which goes back to Francis Bacon. Nature is inanimate matter, and we can use it the way we want it, because we as human beings are entitled to rape, pillage, and plunder the whole world. I think in this sense, I would argue for alternatives to development. But for me, this does not necessarily entail giving up on all efforts of poverty reduction, for example. So this is why this global inequality thing is still important to me. Basically, I think this this term development we can do without it. I think if we have this idea of universal standards, of universal models, there will always be a subordination of some models, and my plea would be for democratic debate, what people actually see as a good society, as an improvement, and there would be issues like dignity, for example, also quite relevant. So alternatives to development. The governance issue, I think you are very right. We have this governance issue. We have issues of corruption in many countries in the South. And this was also something I mentioned, the issue of tax evasion and illicit financial flows is pressing. But this is something where it is not only an issue of the South, but northern banks are just as guilty and just as complicit in all this. Then your point about inequality also being a problem in northern societies, yes. I mean, this is the North in the South and the South in the North. This is why some people talk about global South in the sense of, not in a geographic sense, but in the sense of marginalization taking place, not necessarily in the geographical South. Yes, we have tens of thousands of homeless people in Los Angeles alone. And this is also an issue of poverty and marginalization. Without the UNDP actually sending poverty reduction programs to the United States so far. So, and the last point, how do we get the local on the global agenda? I'm afraid I don't have a good answer on that. I think this is a great challenge. The question is, is it easier to get the local on the global agenda, or is it easier to basically push back the global agenda? Okay, this would be my thought.
Thanks, Aram, once again. Just a little announcement, please, to the people. Please keep your questions short. We are really running out of time. So last 3 questions, and I'm afraid we won't be able to have more. So if I'm not wrong, Luis, can you please go ahead? You can ask me.
Okay. Can you hear me? Okay. I would like to challenge you as well on a slightly different point. And this is, I wonder whether there is still an element of colonialism in your post-colonialism, because the way I understood it, you consider it possible to make a plan which makes the whole world better. So your post-colonial policies are meant to affect everyone in the world, change everything from economics to education to agriculture to knowledge production to governance structures. And you present this long list of necessary change in policy which makes the world better. And to me, this belief that such a long list is possible has got something colonial about it. Because in a way, this is the way colonial powers viewed the world too. That they thought they got this big plan which merely needs to be implemented to make the world a better place.
I think, well, I see your point, but I think there is a misunderstanding, because basically in this part of decolonizing development policy, there were, as you rightly point out, there is some political agenda. Okay, these things should be done. But these things that should be done are merely to basically compensate existing inequalities, and they are not, and this is very, very important to me, a plan of how people actually should work. This plan of, okay, the world would be a better place if we implemented communism or subsistence agriculture or decentralized communes or blah, 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 everywhere. Because this is precisely, and this is where your sensibility is exactly right. This is precisely where where local people's conceptions of how they would actually like to live are being subordinated to this global plan. So basically, this agenda that I highlighted was, in fact, in the first place, designed to allow for different non-global plans, but local plans, which could then be democratically decided upon. This, at least, would be my thrust, my suggestion.
Well, thanks once again. I guess this is an important point that could be further discussed. But because of the time limitation, we have to move on. So, Caroline, can you please ask your question?
Yeah, hi. First of all, thank you very much for your talk. It was, well, most of it, I have to admit, was not new for me, considering I study a similar topic. However, the presentation in which you gave it was amazing. And I would like to ask, first of all, permission to use maybe a recording of this talk, or just the example that you used of Genghis Khan, to drive the point home, because I think that is something we have all seen. Those other maps, we have all kind of seen them somewhere floating around, but we always go back to the European-centric northern side up map. And yeah, I think I just found that really, really nicely done. Thank you very much. And I would also, however, say that much of, let's call it just development policy, should also happen in the global north, in Western societies, in Europe, in the United States, by teaching our history and by raising awareness of what has been happening. Because kids in Belgium don't get taught about the atrocities that happened during the colonial times. Neither do kids in France, Great Britain, Germany. The kids in the United States don't get to know about the genocide and about the still occurring inequality that is happening towards the indigenous populations. I think a major part of all of this is simple awareness in most parts of the world, because it is not taught. People have to go and look for it, and have to go look for this part of history in different sources than their school books, which is, yeah, a big problematic. That's it. I'm going to keep it short. So thank you very much.
Thanks a lot for your kind words. And I perfectly agree. And this is why this is very dear to me, to actually, well, teach them the other side of history and raise awareness. Because for me, a few years ago, these things were also new. I had actually learned, I never learned in school about you mentioned Belgium, about the atrocities, about the scale of the atrocities is just unbelievable, and it just appears nowhere. And yeah, we need to do something about it.
I'm 27 now, and to be honest, like the Belgian thing we're talking about, I just learned by it just on the side actually last year. So this has been missing in my education.
Yeah.
Centrally.
Yeah, let's change the school books.
Yeah. Thank you.
Thanks.
Okay, so we have one last comment. Julia, would you please read what was the comment? There was a question, if I'm not wrong.
Yes, we had one more question by Binna, saying she's been struggling with this question in the last few years, and that has been how to theorize on the power relations among different peoples, regions, and actors in terms of the generation of knowledge and wealth. For instance, the developed format feels rather deterministic and hierarchical, and the North-South division seems to a certain degree too often remove the agency on the southern part. So what are your personal thoughts on this issue, especially in the context of development policy?
Yeah, I perfectly agree that this developed format is rather deterministic, especially if this developed and developing refers to countries where within these countries, of course, there's a huge power structure at hand, which then is somehow sidelined if this is all we talk about, the division between developed and developing countries. So referring to the question of agency, I think this is why postcolonial studies are very useful if we actually integrate different aspects of them. I mean, if we talk about Edward Said, he told us about the power of colonial discourses, but we did not learn much about the agency of the colonized. On the other hand, someone like Homi Bhabha tells us about the agency of the colonized, how they actually appropriated colonial discourse to use it for their own ends. And this is precisely what happened also in the context of development policy. Of course, in its beginnings, in the middle of the 20th century, the idea of development was basically this enterprise of the United States to promise affluence to decolonizing countries to keep them from joining the communist camp, of course. But then in the 50s and 60s, what happened is that this frame of underdeveloped countries was appropriated within the United Nations by decolonizing countries to say, yes, we are underdeveloped, so for this reason we demand special rights in world trade, special and differential treatment in the GATT, the General Agreement on Tariffs and Trade. We demand a special fund for the economic development of our countries, the Sunfed Fund, which was then not put into place because it was too much for the rich countries to grant, but they said, okay, now you get the International Development Association, which is the soft loan window of the World Bank nowadays. So, and these questions of agency are, I think, very, very interesting. And postcolonial studies and post-development offer good tools to talk about them, and to also, and we need also to bear in mind that power relations are prevalent and omnipresent even beyond this division between developed and developing countries. Short answer.
So unfortunately, we are running out of time now. So we have to wrap up. I would like to thank everyone for participation, for the really good questions. Aram, you of course for the great talk. Yeah, we would like to point out that we will make the webinar available online, which will be on YouTube. There's an EADI YouTube channel, but you can also find it via the EADI website. So give us a few days so we can put it in the right format, and then it will be able to be rewatched in case you missed anything. Also, please, we would like to invite you to join the working group. It's a really open group. You don't have to be professor or anything to be able to join. So if you're just interested in anything related to post-colonial, decolonial studies or perspectives on development, please just send us a message and join. Yeah, we'll hope you be joining us again for the next webinar, which will hopefully be in March, but we will let you know of the details further the time, nearer the time. So yeah, thanks on behalf of Aftab and myself. Thanks for joining, and hope to see you again.
Thanks for organizing and thanks for participating. Bye.